Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me here. So, my name is Irina Moore. I work for a research and analytics firm called Ampere Analysis, which is specialized in the media and entertainment sector. So, it covers everything from sort of tracking the catalogs of streamers, for example, to sports rights, revenues of the key broadcasters, content spend, and where I work, it's the commissioning team. So we track really the commissions by all the key broadcasters in all the major markets, the streamers and other major financiers involved in sort of getting projects off the ground. So today I'll be covering the main commissioning trends when it comes to television commissions of children's content. And as we all know, the commissioning market has undergone quite a lot of changes over recent years in the sort of post-peak TV era, where revenues were under sort of more strain for some of the broadcasters, but also content spend, availability of content to spend on commissions has been under a lot of pressure. So today I'll be covering the presentation in three sort of sections. The first one, trying to look at where kids commissioning is at in general within the big commissioning market compared to other genres, what it means from a producer perspective in terms of what type of content is most likely to secure a commission in this context, and also trying to contextualize some of this in the broader distribution trends that we are seeing, and also related to that some of the consumer or sort of viewing data that we're having, which ties in quite nicely with what Elena was talking about. So brief mention that you're very welcome to take pictures of all the slides, but at the end there will also be a QR code if you wish to download the entire presentation. So to start off with on the wider commissioning trends, I thought I'll start with this beautiful sort of spaghetti mess of a chart, where you see the growth rate, the year-on-year growth rate for commissioning volumes for the different key genres that we track. And you see that here in the bold pink line, children's TV commissions have undergone quite steep sort of curves, quite low lows and high peaks, compared to perhaps if you look at the crime and thriller genre in the sort of light purple color, which also went into decline in this post-peak period, but then not quite as starkly, and also bounced back, but not quite as strongly. So in a sense, this is to evidence that children's TV commissions, because of their nature, especially when it comes to animations, they're more expensive, they can be quite time-consuming to produce, they're more risky sort of projects for commissioners to go with, especially, as I said, for animation. So the commissioning landscape for children's television is a little bit more subject to market fluctuations than perhaps other genres. The good news is that the market is stabilizing. So when I'll be, throughout the next few charts, referring to volumes over the last year, what I mean is the 12 months up to end of April 25, which is where I cut off the data to have it in time for this presentation. So as you can see, there were some really steep declines in the volume of children's TV commissions announced globally. But over the last year, this volume has stabilized somewhat, although we still see, in terms of first run as well as renewals, a slightly lower rate than over the previous year. And equally, if we compare where children's TV commissions stand by annual growth rate compared to other genres, and here I'm only singling out scripted trends, which obviously there's always a lot more pressure on scripted than unscripted due to the budgets involved. We see that children now occupy sort of a middle ground at -4% annual growth rate in volume terms. Again, I'm emphasizing this is volumes, so this does not represent the budgets involved, but just the number of titles that have been commissioned. And you see that children's TV commissions are doing a little bit better than crime and romance, but not as well as perhaps drama. And we really see that comedy is taking off, that commissioners are really going for a lot of comedy titles in the current landscape, and I'm quite grateful for it in the current social, political, and economic landscape that we're undergoing. So, to break it down a little bit on a regional basis, to understand what is behind these trends, we see that a lot of the bouncing back we're seeing comes from the North American region, which has seen a plus 7% growth rate in the volume of commissions over the last year. But this comes, of course, on the back of the steep decline that we saw 2 years in a row. Whereas for the Western European region, we are at a lower level, minus 7%. But as you can see, the decline started sort of with a 1-year lag. There is sometimes a little bit of this time lag between market pressures and their impact in these regions. We could hypothesize that perhaps to some extent we'll see a little bit of a bounce back over the coming year in Western Europe in volume terms. But in North America, let's look a little bit more to break this down in terms of the type of players that are involved in these commissions and where some of this growth is coming from. So as you see, if we break it down by type of player, public media, very dominant in the Western European children's TV commissioning landscape, really provide a bedrock of stability in relative terms, decline of minus 6% followed by plus 3% over the last year, whereas the streamers here under the SVOD banner, minus 25% 2 years ago, minus 36% last year. So really, they are pulling out of commissioning children's TV content at quite a drastic rate. Commercial free-to-air television commissioners continue to also see some pressure due to dwindling TV advertising revenues, but we see that it's not as stark as what was happening 2 years ago. And quite interestingly, pay TV commissioners really bouncing back by almost as much, plus 35% on the back of minus 33% 2 years ago. And if we look in a little bit more detail on what's happening on the pay TV side, it's quite interesting if we focus on the US major studios like Paramount or Disney, or Warner Brothers, that across their subsidiaries that are streaming platforms or pay TV commissioners, there is a very different trend. So the pay TV sees a bouncing back in commissioning volumes, whereas for their streaming platforms, they're just continuing to cut volume. So there's one hypothesis behind this, although it's quite early days to interpret this trend, because obviously these are commissions, a lot of them have not been released yet, so we don't necessarily have insights into the release strategies for a lot of these pay TV commissions. But one hypothesis is that the studios are capitalizing on what's a very strong brand associated with some of these pay TV subsidiaries like Nickelodeon in the children's space, and they're looking to establish new content there, as well as through social media first, before wider distribution through SVOD platforms. So really using the SVOD or streaming subsidiaries that they have as a distribution tool, so to speak, more than commissioning original content, as was the case in the past. The pressure on budgets is also evidenced in the type of co-commissions that we're seeing, so where more than one commissioner comes together to really get a project past the sort of greenlighting stage. Over the last 12 months up to end of April 25, we see there's a rise compared to the past in terms of the share of projects that were co-commissioned, but also in the type of co-commissions that we have. For example, 2 years ago, a lot more of these co-commissions consisted of what's here in the sort of grayer color, involving streaming players. But as they've pulled out, we see a lot more of the different shades of blue here over the last year, involving public broadcasters, co-commissioning with different partners. And we know, for example, that the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, has been very active also in this space to support co-commissioning, co-production activity across European broadcasters in the animation space. Finally, just briefly to conclude on the sort of broader trends, from a UK perspective, we can see that broadly the trends are mirrored in the sense that we have also seen this massive decline in volumes of children's commissions in the UK a couple of years ago, and then we see the stabilization, so this sort of new normal at a lower level now, and even a slight rise in the last year. And the bulk of the commissions continue to stem from public broadcasters, here close to 60% share of this market. And we see that amongst the major commissioning groups, that the global streamers are pretty much pulling out completely of the children's commissioning landscape here, whereas there's this sort of stabilization across others, and BBC as well as BBC Studios picking up the commissioning activity in volume terms. Although, of course, we know that it's much harder for the BBC to fully fund projects now, and more partnerships are required. Now, where are the opportunities for securing commissions? So here I'll delve into a little bit more the content trends, what kind of commissions are being greenlit, and what it means in terms of commissions. So first of all, let's look at renewals and cancellation rates. So our data shows that the average number of TV seasons here in the right-hand chart, or rather left for you, it shows that on average, live-action content is far more likely to reach a high number of seasons in terms of renewals. Over the last year, educational content here prevails, of course, but also we see game shows and comedy reaching over 7 seasons on average in terms of renewals. When it comes to animation here and cancellation rates, we see that really this pressure on budgets is translated quite starkly in this line in pink. This represents the number of seasons reached on average by an animation project before its official cancellation. And it used to be around the 5 to 6 seasons on average. It dropped to 2 seasons, so really quite stark cuts and stark, difficult decisions made there, but it's slightly bouncing back, so the picture is slightly better now, at average of 3 seasons over the last year. Now let's just look at the first commissions. So projects that are launched for the first time, first-run children's TV commissions, and here are broken it down. I've excluded animations for now, and are breaking it down by sort of subgenres across live-action children's content. And what's interesting here, if you look at how these volumes are evolving over time, so you have the purple line for what was happening 3 years ago, the green line for the last year, and you see that quite systematically the volume is lower, so although educational content prevails, but the volume is cut pretty much across every sub-genre category. But the outliers here are action and adventure, but also, as you can see, scripted comedy. So live-action comedy is not just becoming really quite an important choice for commissioners in content aimed at an adult audience, but also for children. It's really making quite a stark comeback. When it comes to animation projects, our analysis of the sort of main themes that emanate from the last year's commissions, we see that female representation continues to be very strong amongst lead protagonists of animations. We also see that animals, anthropomorphic animal characters, are really very, very popular. They've always been, but now even more than in the past, we see more of them than other types of anthropomorphic characters like objects or more human-like figures. And this is, by the way, reflected also in live-action commissions, where we see anything to do with animals being very, very popular and appearing more amongst the commissions that are being picked. And finally, more sort of value-driven content to do with friendship and social bond being quite an important theme, more than ever, I would say. Partly, perhaps this is a bit of the Bluey effect, but also perhaps we see a little bit less of the more sort of superpowers types, magical settings and all of that. And this is perhaps tied to some of the reduction in the volume of franchises that we're seeing in the commissions, which brings me to the next slide on the IP trends. So titles that were based on original IP, meaning they're not based on franchise or other pre-existing intellectual property, adaptations, etc., have more opportunities now than they did in the past. And here we see the share of titles that are based on original IP, slightly dipped for Europe about a year ago, but now coming back quite strongly. But very interestingly, in the North American space, especially with a lot of the cuts we've seen from the streamers in the US, we see that although a lot of the content was based on franchises, still the lowest sort of level amongst the different regions, but we see that there's a very strong uptick here with the pink line reaching 58% and 53% of titles being based on new IP. And this is to do with the withdrawal of some of the streamers that we talked about earlier. Another way of looking at it is if you just pick out titles that were based on franchises only, and you look at the volume, and here you can really see that streamers really were occupying a very important space in this franchise-based commissioning amongst children's television, and how that drop really is impacting sort of the share of franchises within the bigger commissioning landscape here. And one final point on IP. So if we break it down across all the different types of titles that are based on pre-existing IP, here looking on the right at the last year and on the left 2 years earlier, we see that the kind of adaptation, the kind of content that is being drawn on has slightly changed as well. So book adaptations continue to occupy a very important space here, quite a dominant one, but you see that spin-offs here related to more franchise type of commissions have lost in share. And also very interestingly, you see in the green color, comic and manga adaptations had more than doubled in share. And this reflects quite a strong trend that children's children's publishers are seeing as well, that really comic books and mangas are taking off, and the sale of this type of content is very strong currently. And so we can expect to see more and more of these sort of adaptations coming to screen. So we're talking here about content like Diaries of a Wimpy Kid or Tom Gates and all these sort of new comic books that are becoming very popular amongst kids these days. So while there are more opportunities for new and original IP, commissions based on pre-existing IP or franchise will continue, despite some of these market fluctuations, to play quite an important role in the commissioning landscape for children's TV. And that's partly tied to the changes in the distribution landscape. So there's so much kids' content available that the threshold for brand recognition is much higher than it used to be in the past. And that content that is tied to an existing IP or brand stands a better chance of being viewed. So while SVOD players have cut their commissions in originals in the children's TV space, when it comes to content acquisition and licensing, it's a very different picture that we see. And here I'll just spend the last few minutes focusing a little bit on some of the distribution trends that we're seeing to provide more context to these commissioning trends. So as you can see here, we're looking at just the volume of hours of content available in catalogs in the UK only. And you can see that we're talking about over 20,000 hours of children's TV and movie content available across streaming platforms in the UK. Not only is it very stark, very significant in number of hours, but it's also continuing to rise. And as you can see here, BBC iPlayer relatively well positioned compared to some of the individual streaming platforms that we're seeing at around 4,000 hours of content on average. So the commissioners continue to bulk up their catalogs with a lot of content. They need a lot of content. And at the same time, viewing time for subscription OTT is plateauing. So they're not necessarily, so there is a lot of demand for content that is likely to support wider viewing, longer viewing hours, especially as the streamers are looking to move more and more into having revenue stemming from the advertising side of things. And we've seen them sort of move into the sports rights field, for example, live events, and all sorts of other strategies to achieve this. But as you can see also here in households with children, free social video, for example, YouTube viewing is on the rise and very significantly so. And we know that data available shows that if you look not just at the household level, but just at children's consumption, YouTube really dominates very strongly. So it's unsurprising that the streamers are increasingly tapping into content stemming from social media to support the viewing experience on their platforms. So here we're looking at the data released by Netflix themselves, their viewing data, which they have unfortunately stopped providing now. But the latest round of data available shows that amongst the top viewed children TV shows that were under 10 years old, there are a lot here, as you can see in pink, of titles that originated on YouTube. And we've also seen Miss Rachel, the recent deal for having Miss Rachel's sort of content available on Netflix as well. And if you compare this to what was the case a couple of years ago, well, there were a lot more Netflix original in this top chart. So this addresses quite directly what Elena was referring to earlier in terms of a lot of this YouTube content making it to the fore within this platform environment. But also streamers are increasingly tapping into brands that are established, that are big, and that also into older IP to do so, licensing content that from big brands. And we see that the share of content that is older within the big streamer catalogs in the UK is on the rise. So content that is over 5 and 10 years old or over 10 years old is reaching a level that we haven't seen before. So this also creates opportunities for people who have availability to some of these rights and sit on an IP that is older and can be tapped into. And finally, a couple of words on UK content and the opportunities it has within this landscape. Well, actually, UK content features very prominently amongst the children's TV show in Global Streamers catalog, right behind US content, and ahead of French content, for example, as well as Japanese manga content. So really, there is space for further growth there, I believe. And also, this is evidenced if we look at this last slide, before I move to the next slide where you'll have the QR code and you'll be able to download the slide deck. So there is scope for broad international distribution of UK content through streaming and beyond. So here we're looking at the proportion of children's TV content produced in a market that is exclusively or only available within that given market, meaning it's not available or distributed outside of its own borders. And here, unsurprisingly, we see US content seeing the lowest rate across, which meaning it's the widest distributed across key global markets, and the rate for the US continues to reduce. The same is happening also for UK and French produced content, but from a much higher basis. So you can see also that there is an acceleration for French produced content, for example, over the last couple of years, which is not mirrored in the UK, where about 50% of the content remains distributed only in the UK, suggesting their scope to tap into opportunities for wider international distribution still, but also to produce content that is best suited to tap into some of these opportunities. And with that, I'll leave you the final slide with the QR code. And thank you very much for your time today.
Hello there, thank you for that. I am Paul Powell from Black Dog Television. Looking at the dominance of American content, do you think the strike action of 23 had an impact on commissioning?
So it did to some extent, but I mean, in the UK it was slightly noticed, but I don't think it was like as big an impact, obviously, as in the US market. And we've seen this really apply to scripted children's content in particular. So it was it came on the back of what was already a declining market, actually, from the end of 22. So it exacerbated some of the existing trends, so to speak. Yeah.
Hi. With regards to the content that's been produced over the past few years and content that's being predicted to be commissioned, are there trends with regards to the age group of the target audience in terms of preschool or older children, teen?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the data that we track does not differentiate by age group at present. We have plans to develop that. So I don't have as much insight into that, unfortunately. But at least in terms of the content that we're seeing coming from, for example, some of the social media space into the wider streaming distribution space, we are seeing that a lot of it is very much preschool specific. So I don't know if that doesn't quite answer your question, but it gives an indication, perhaps.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for that. Lucy Murphy from Sky. I was just wondering where the data comes from in terms of number of commissions and genre. Sure. Only I didn't recognise some of them.
Okay. Yeah, so it comes from a team that we have that tracks commissions on based on, well, manually, so based on what the commissioners themselves are announcing through trade publications, social media, etc. So yeah, so that is, it's basically, it doesn't necessarily reflect perhaps what from an internal perspective you're aware of in terms of commissioning activity, but we can only go by what is being announced officially at any particular point in time. And the genre, we have sort of genre categories that are manually allocated by the analysts themselves based on the description of each project and tagging some of those. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We'll include you in our commissioning announcements then, so that you've got them all. Thank you.
But yeah, feel free to come and talk to me if you'd like any more, to discuss any of this more over a coffee break. Thank you.